Welcome to Unspoken Podcast. I am Anna Paz, and today I thought it would be interesting, since the World Cup is happening right now, to speak about two things that have greatly impacted and influenced my practice and how they may have influenced and impacted one another. And most of my references today will be from the book O Negro e o Futebol Brasileiro, written by Mário Filho. And there's actually a documentary based on this book with the same title on YouTube, so I'll put the link in the description of this episode. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast, then I'm sure you already know that I practice Capoeira Angola. It is something very fundamental in the ways that I'm sharing, the ways that I'm learning and cultivating my connection to my African heritage as well as my artistic practice. But many of you might not know that I played football for many years. And when I started Capoeira, I felt that my years of playing football really helped me in relation to my awareness, of my body and other bodies in space and how they are moving in the space. And after a conversation with a friend during a roda in London, I think it was 3 weeks ago now, we reflected on how Capoeira has most definitely influenced football that we know and love today. And so shout out to Lana, because she gave me this idea for this episode. And actually, when I started playing football, watching football, I played football since I was 6 years old, but I started watching football a bit later. And of course, the player that inspired me, made me fall in love with the game, was Ronaldinho, who for me is the best to ever play the game, in my humble opinion, at least in the time in which I was watching football. And I really loved how fluid he played, a way of moving that just sort of defied the linear norms, just dislocating the body, throwing your body in one direction, throwing the opponent into another direction, and a footwork that was executed to an invisible rhythm, a rhythm that came from the inside out. And it almost makes you look like what you're doing from the outside. It resembles sort of dancing, I would say. It's a way of moving that really truly expresses the individual's identity, their own creativity, their own persona, I would say. What we might understand as Ginga in Capoeira, but also actually it is the Ginga that gave the unique style of football that coined the term futebol arte, or o jogo bonito, that Brazilians made popular. And Ginga is a foundational movement in Capoeira. Not just Capoeira, but you could also find Ginga in Samba as well. And I think in many Afro-Brazilian cultural expressions, there is this aspect of Ginga incorporated in some way. And looking at the Book of Names from Angola by Aristotle Kandimba, one of the descriptions of the word Ginga, which is spelled with the letter J, is to turn, to twist, to move in a circular direction as if dominated by other forces but your own. Now, that's a very interesting description, given how I also think about Ronaldinho and a lot of Brazilian players. And in light of this, in many African nations that were present in this year's World Cup, some for the very first time, and even many European countries with strong teams that have black players of African descent, I think it's really good to reflect on how black players and the black experience has undoubtedly shaped football. I'll be focusing mostly on Brazil and the Afro-Brazilian culture, which includes Capoeira, together with the emergence of football as Brazil's national sport, intertwined with the project of nation building and modernization. Maybe that is one of the reasons that this team is the team with the most World Cups. Now, versions of ball games existed in ancient societies, ancient times I'm sure, but the modern association to football emerged in the 19th century in Britain, where schools and clubs gradually developed the common rules, and then Cambridge rules of the mid-1800s helped standardize the play. And in 1863, the Football Association was established, and what we call, the FA, created a framework for the game that we recognize today. Although the game in Brazil was introduced by elite Brazilians returning from Europe in the late 19th century, rich families that could send their children abroad to study. So in the beginning, football was quite a middle class to upper sports or recreational activity, but its appeal was never confined exclusively to the upper classes. It would gradually come out to more urban, poorer settings, I guess, where there would be their own improvised matches on roads or anywhere where there was space to do so. And I guess this is what we might call a street football. And sometimes not even with an actual football, balls made out of different materials, rubber bands. This became an increasingly common pastime among working class and black communities, especially after the abolition of slavery in 1888. So while elite clubs controlled the official competitions, black players developed their skills in lower suburban leagues, informal matches, and eventually transforming the sport with their own flair, their own style of play that was rooted in their own, improvisation, creativity that stemmed from their very own environment, their corporal archive of their lived experiences, their ancestral inheritance, the resilience that reflected the conditions that they lived in. The Ginga that we spoke about that can be found in capoeira or samba is very much situated in black communities, in spaces where black people would come together to practice their culture. What is cool to find out when I was watching the documentary, that some of the earlier lower suburban leagues that were founded, that we have records of, they said that these first football teams were formed within Sao Paulo's black communities within the city's two most important samba schools. So these community centers also adopted football as a recreational and cultural practice amongst black workers, and they just embraced the sport as their part of their everyday life. So it just became a huge syncretism with other black cultural expressions. Now, the nationalization of football accelerated during Getúlio Vargas' Estado Novo in the 1930s and the 1940s, and there was an increased state intervention in transforming the sport into a symbol of national unity. Not just football, but samba went through this process, and so did capoeira, to not only obviously expand the popularity of it, but also to incorporate it into a broader political project that sought to sort of modernize and integrate Brazilian population. So like samba and capoeira, football was recognized as being a potential authentic expression of the nation. But unlike samba and capoeira, that was born out of African roots, black resilience, that had to be reconfigured to be Brazilian. Football, they took that creativity and reinvention of black players to fundamentally reshape a sport originally imported from England. And in that sense, it introduced a more creative, more technically sophisticated style that eventually came to be defined as Brazilian football. And Mario, he really argues this, that black players were so fundamental in shaping and defining what is Brazilian football. At the same time, football reflected this racial ideology shaped by Brazilian society during the first half of the 20th century. Professional football created new opportunities for black players, but the racist beliefs never died, and they continued to influence the public perception of their abilities. And this particularly was visible when Brazil was defeated in the 1950 World Cup. 3 black players, Barbosa, Bigode, Juvenal, all 3 were directly involved in Uruguay's second goal, basically, which won the game. And it's interesting how this is still something that happens today in recent times with the likes of Saka or Sancho, Rashford for England. When black players don't perform well, their blackness is suddenly the reason why. There was this widespread belief that black players lacked both the ability and the emotional resilience to cope with situations of extreme pressure at this elite level. And these arguments are still something that I'm hearing in circles, even now with this World Cup and the African nations that have been knocked out. But this assumption, I really believe, is fundamentally rooted in a racist ideology that's just reinforcing the idea that the black population or black culture or black people are inherently inferior, when in fact, have we had the same infrastructure, the same opportunities, the same amount of money, the same amount of time, the same feeling of taking up space without being heavily scrutinized? Not really. In fact, one of Brazil's best players, Domingos da Guia, celebrated for being just beautiful way. He was a defender, but he wasn't rugged, like rough defender. He was elegant. He was graceful. He had style. He knew how to dribble. And he used his background in samba to help him with dribbling. And one of the big reasons is that he said in this documentary that black players could be heavily penalized for even making contact with white players. And I think this really shifts the sort of mentality that you have to have. It's not just about your talent. It's also about the political frame in which you're playing the game. Football is political, and it always has been. And only after Brazil's victory in the 1958 World Cup that was led by Pelé, and these black and mixed race players sort of changed the narrative, and this particular narrative began to lose its legitimacy. And Pelé's rise, really represented more than just a football success. It really was a symbol, a consolidation of football as the central element of Brazilian identity. And simultaneously, it was also exposing those contradictions between the country's celebrated ideals of racial harmony, but persistent structural racism. Now I'm thinking of the added success of the Brazilian national team that I grew up watching, with the likes of Ronaldinho, Ronaldo, Roberto Carlos, that era of Jogo Bonito. And I remember when I was playing, I don't know where I was, maybe in Leicester, and the coach told me, I didn't know at the time, back in the day, and even when he told me, but he said to me that the way we practice dribbling, the drills that we have and that we use and have been using for the last 30 years is because of the Brazilian national team. And now, as someone who practices capoeira, thinking about the ginga, thinking about the footwork and the control of the body and the sort of like manipulation of not only one's body, but how you have to almost think ahead about how you want the other person to move too. Yeah, there's definitely a correlation there for me. So as some of us enjoy the World Cup, and I understand that many African teams have been knocked out, and Brazil has just been knocked out, but I just want to give a shout out to Cabo Verde. The way they played against Argentina, oh my God, that was the first game that I actually watched. I had to watch that game even though it was so late or early in the morning. But I think it's super important to remember the contributions of Africa, the African diaspora in the game of football, since it is their unique experience and their corporal reality, their resilience to forge their own creativity within this game that greatly contributed to football as a beautiful game. So I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.